through the water, you just kind of see the outline of a wreck, and eventually it turns into this ship. You know, it's kind of a unique experience.
I enjoy historic sites. Just being able to be there and touch them is to me part of the experience.
The biggest thing is it's tangible history, something you can put your hands on. It's not somebody telling you a story, it's you've heard the story and now I can actually see the physical manifestation.
The steamship America draws them in to Lake Superior's icy depths to explore what remains below the surface.
Part of the experience is just imagining, you know, what the lives of these people were like. This was my first real shipwreck. I can remember looking up and the ship listed a little bit to port, and my brain would go, whoa, that's really hard on the brain. So.
The first time I ever had a chance to dive the America, I was probably only 16. Back then, the Model T truck that was in there was still intact. The piano in the salon was still intact. It didn't take a lot of imagination to see these parties going on with people walking around in the salon, and you can go down in the galley and you can still, the pots and pans are still down there.
It helps form the picture of what it was like on the America, you know, back in the day.
It's kind of the history of us along the North Shore.
Explore the Steamship America, a North Shore legend. The America steamed through the Duluth Ship Canal in 1902. She cruised through the city's new and improved concrete piers and went right to work. The 164-foot-long steamer was billed as one of the finest and fastest freight and passenger boats available. Duluth was a bustling town of 70,000 citizens and growing fast. There were docks for grain, flour, lumber, and coal everywhere along the waterfront. Fleets of passenger ships and Great Lakes freighters racked up nearly 3,000 arrivals each season. The city boasted more than a dozen rail lines with connections to Chicago, Omaha, St. Paul, and Minneapolis. The port was a busy place. A company executive who came up on the America's inaugural run promised the ship would be operated as a first-class steamer.
She has a speed of 18 miles an hour, which will mean much in the North Shore traffic. In fact, previous trips have been tedious because of the average slowness of the boats. Booth Line Superintendent C.W. Turner.
Speed was her competitive advantage.
It ran around 19 miles an hour, which is really, you know, that's 21, 22 knots, so that's moving right along.
A. Booth & Company, a Chicago-based fish wholesaler, brought the steamer to Duluth to grab more of the freight and passenger business at the western end of Lake Superior. Booth's main rival, the White Line, owned by Walter Singer, added the Iroquois to its fleet within days of the America's arrival. The two ships slipped immediately into competition.
The Booth Line people are said to have a great deal of confidence in the America's fleetness, while the Singer Line people aver their readiness to have a test of speed for money, chalk, or marbles at any time. The Duluth Evening Herald, April 29, 1902.
Her schedule included 3 round trips a week with regular stops in 2 harbors, Beaver Bay, Grand Marais, and Grand Portage, Fort William and Port Arthur. She circled Isle Royal, delivering passengers and collecting fish before coming back to the mainland to return to Duluth.
You could almost say it was a passenger liner. It would have a definite time, say at Two Harbors it would be there, and at Grand Marais it might be vary a little bit between times, and arrival up at Fort William and at Rock Harbor and then at Wendigo specific times, but it was on a pretty tight schedule.
The combination of reliable service and stylish trimmings gave her a charmed reputation along the shore. The America was built as an excursion boat in 1898. More staterooms were added when she took on freight duties on Lake Superior. An elegant spiral staircase and skylights were part of the package.
The roof of the boat deck was raised a little bit, curved on the top, and then skylights along the sides. So it would have looked quite nice.
It didn't look like a working freighter. It had red carpet, it had some chandeliers, it had lovely tableware. It did its job, but it did its job with a lot of grace.
Deliveries from the America were a critical lifeline for remote settlements all along her route.
Anything you needed, from livestock to medicine to mail to clothes to flour, sugar, staples, it all had to come in on the boats.
As a package freighter, it could be furniture, it could be panes of glass, crates of oil lamps. It could be just about anything that you could either drag on or wheel on or carry or load into a gunny sack. Anything was open and fair game for cargo.
My grandfather's brother bought a home from Sears and Roebuck, and I think it was $800 fully, and that included a carpenter for a couple of weeks. But it came up on the steamer America, and it was unloaded on the Tofte dock, and they assembled the house. So there's a honest-to-goodness Sears and Roebuck home that came up in the America.
It's just that kind of boat. If you could load it on there, it was fair game.
Commercial fishing was big business in the early 1900s. The Booth Company bought fish from all around Lake Superior to sell in Chicago and beyond. The company was handling more than 100 tons a month.
That boat was extremely valuable to the fishermen along the shore as far as hauling their fish. And it was also a passenger ship for the fishermen because they didn't have any other way of getting to their fishing houses.
You had fish houses all up and down the shore. Everyone that could possibly crowd a fish house in on the shore, that was their livelihood.
There were few docks deep enough to take the steamer's draft, so the ship anchored offshore and relied on her customers to come get their orders and bring out their catch.
The fishermen would roll out their barrels of fish, which were 100 pounds, and then they had a cable winch scenario where the keg lifter would grab the keg and lift it up to the boat. And that was the dangerous part, because if that broke in any way, it would land right into their wooden skiff and they would clearly have a broken boat.
Yeah, pretty dangerous because you have all that weight in a boat, and if you go hard into the steel hull of the America, that's not a good scenario for you in a wooden boat. The level of skill to make that happen is phenomenal.
You want everything to happen on the lee side of the boat, so which side's that going to be this time? Are you doing it at night? Are you doing it in the fog as a daylight? You tie it up thinking, well, gee, if you tie it up too tight, you're going to lift it out of the water and then have it splash down. So yeah, it is a dance. There is definitely skill. There's partnership involved in how these things work and work successfully.
America is really remembered as the apex of maritime trade on the North Shore.
The arrival of steamers like the America ushered in the golden age of tourism on Isle Royale. Interest in travel and outdoor recreation was blossoming across the country in the early 1900s. fueled by seamless transportation links between railroads and passenger ships.
It was an escape from the big city, the probably pretty dirty air because everyone was heating with coal and whatnot. And it was just a clean, fresh air, sunshine kind of place to be.
The Johns family was the first to offer cabins for rent and soon needed to expand.
He had several buildings over here that he accommodated tourists in, our great-grandfather, John F. Johns. But he ran out of room, the ships kept coming up here, and people, he said, I can't take any more. They had to turn them away, you know, so then he built this place.
They built a one-story building. Then a couple years later, they took that roof off and added the second story.
He had 2 bedrooms in the back, 4 bedrooms upstairs, so 6 more bedrooms, plus what he had over here, so he could accommodate some more. But still, by 1900, it was just too many people coming up.
There was so much interest in staying on the island, Walter Singer, owner of the White Line, was motivated to build. His Singer Hotel went up in 1902.
And John F. Johns convinced Mr. Singer, the Singer Sewing Machine Company, to build the Singer Hotel on the other island, because he had so many guests here he couldn't handle them all.
The Island House Resort, or Singerville, included a pool room and barber shop in the main lodge, and a pavilion with a bowling alley and dance hall, plus 10 cottages with private outhouses.
He spent $80,000 and built the hotel across the harbor, great big hotel over there. And then my grandfather, great-grandfather, got out of the business, and a couple years later then sold the island to Mr. Barnum.
Just up the bay in Washington Harbor, a private hunting and fishing lodge, the Washington Club, was organized by a group of wealthy Duluth businessmen. Summer communities sprang up at both ends of the island.
There's a photo of the America coming around Hotel Island here.
At the northeast end of the island, Gust Mattson, a member of the Mattson fishery, started his resort across the bay from the family fish camp in Tobin Harbor.
The resort it was coming to, that was another Mattson, part of the same family. Started fishing from that island and then switched to a resort. He apparently liked dealing with people rather than fish.
I think once you went to Isle Royale and had a good time, that you went back over and over again, and you told other people about it, and word spread pretty far. So there was good coverage of Isle Royale in the Chicago papers, and really in the Detroit paper, in Duluth and Minneapolis, St. Paul. It was just a place to go.
By 1904, the remote island boasted 4 full-fledged resorts and attracted thousands of intrepid travelers, lured by the promise of fresh air and fresh fish.
If you could afford it, it was fun, and you could enjoy the voyage on the way up. There were the staterooms, if that's what you could afford, or the more steerage kind of rooms, which is just a bunk room more or less. But there was a way to get there. There would be a place for you at the other end.
I was told that, could count on the America, for many different reasons, or the other smaller boats couldn't offer those possibilities,
At the turn of the 20th century, Minnesota's North Shore was accessible only by water. Beyond a few tote roads used by logging companies and a fledgling stagecoach operation, anything north of 2 harbors required a strong back and a rowboat.
There are no roads, so you have this little town that's clustered along the shore and that people know each other and help each other out, but the outside world is only accessible through the water. So where we get in our car and we turn on the key and the ignition and we drive, you get in your boat and you start to row, and you maybe row several miles to the next town.
When a group of Norwegian immigrants came from Tofte, Norway, to join relatives in Tofte, Minnesota, the steamer America was a logical choice.
The Mesabi Range had opened up for iron ore, so there was a tremendous demand for railroad ties. And then Duluth and two harbors were growing, so there was a need for lumber. So our family quickly built logging camps, employed 60 to 70 men, had 12 teams of horses. And then in 1902, my grandfather and his brother went back to Norway to entice the family in Tofte, Norway, to come over now because they had farming, fishing, a real opportunity.
Their arrival doubled the population overnight.
They brought their traditions with them, logging and fishing that they'd earned and learned in Norway or Sweden or Finland. They just adapted them.
When they first came here, they fished with hook lines, and so they would go far out into the lake, 5, 10, 15 miles out to fish for trout, and but they came back in. And Hans questioned why they came back in, and they said they came in to get fresh water. When they first came here from Norway, they had been fishing in the sea their whole life, and they went right to work. They didn't even think that they could drink the water from the lake.
It looks like what you left in Norway, that same rocky coast, but it smells different because it's fresh water, not salt water. But you know that nets caught fish in Norway and nets will catch them here. And you can learn and you can apply those skills you had before here to survive in this land. And they did.
The captains entrusted with running boats on Lake Superior face a daunting task. They have to provide regular and reliable service on one of the world's most challenging bodies of water.
There's always an element of danger out here just because of the lake itself. Our average water temperature is around 42 degrees, and things can happen even on calm days.
The captains in charge of the America were well equipped to handle mighty Lake Superior in all her moods. Her first, Captain Jacob Frederick Hector, had a knack for navigating the beautiful and treacherous shore. His skill earned him an excellent reputation.
Captain Hector had a nickname. His nickname was the Fog King. He would sound the ship's horn, and he could hear the echo come back from the North Shore, and depending on if it was echoing off of rock or just the hillside, he could get a feeling for where he was.
He knew, and I think he could sense how far he was along the shore. And the shore it's just pretty much sheer rock.
Captain Edward Smith served as Hector's first mate for 8 seasons before taking over the top job. By then, the duo's exploits had reached legendary status.
Captain Smith and the myth that he could essentially, echolocate where he was by, tooting his horn. You don't hear that about any of the other vessels.
Bill Wasbatten, a wheelsman with first-hand knowledge, confirms the story.
When we got up to Port Arthur and Fort William, he went up what's known as Mission Creek. We had to go up that channel, and if it was foggy, he blew the whistle and listened for the echo of a certain elevator, and he could tell where he was. I thought that was, I didn't like that naturally, but we made it.
The captain's skill allowed the America to keep running on time, day and night, in fair weather and foul. A huge accomplishment with the navigation tools he had on board.
What you have to navigate with was pretty mundane stuff. You had a thermometer, a barometer, probably an anemometer, magnetic compass, your experience, and a little spit in the wind and see what's happening with the weather.
Today we've got GPS, radar, depth finders, and our charts are far more accurate. You know, like I always tell people, it's the world's largest lake, and it took them a long time to get all of those little rocks and points marked on those charts. And luckily for us, those are the guys that came before and found the rocks, ran aground, did those things, so now we know where they're at.
There's plenty of times the America went up on rocks too, but obviously never enough to put it out of commission for a whole lot of time.
Its route was lots of reefs, lots of rocks, lots of islands, lots of fog, and it's lucky it survived, because you know, with one little wrong turn at Isle Royale and you're into a reef. So they had to know what they were doing.
You look at it back then, and the amount of tonnage that they were carrying on the lake wasn't that far off of what we do now. But when a 1,000-foot freighter can carry over 60,000 tons of iron ore at a time, that was literally 10 or 15 boats. So there were far more ships navigating the lake. So it wasn't that hard to imagine coming around a corner around the end of the island and somebody else trying to cut the corner at the same time, where they'd get a little bit closer or bump into each other.
Mother Nature's in charge, and you're along for the ride. And it's best to smile and say please and thank you, and deal with what you're given. Don't try and stretch beyond your means or beyond the means of the craft that you're on.
In November of 1905, the America survived one of the deadliest storms in Lake Superior history. She was returning from Port Arthur in heavy seas when she passed the steamer Mataafa at Two Harbors. The lake was already wild enough to be dangerous. America continued to Duluth. The Mataafa turned around to follow her.
Several times the waves almost carried our ship into shore, sideways. The America was lighter than the Mataafa and rode high in the water, which might have made it easier for us to sail to safety. Thor Hagen, wheelsman.
They said that the waves were so high at some points that the whole ship canal would disappear. And then, you know, they would come back up and then you could see everything again. But it was up and down, up and down.
The America fought her way through the ship canal amid storm-tossed timbers. But the Mataafa was destined for disaster.
The Mataafa started to come into the harbor, and just as the nose of the boat got in between the two ends of the piers, a wave pushed it and it smacked up against the north pier.
Then another giant wave slammed her midship against the opposite pier. The next spun her around and grounded her 600 feet from shore. The helpless vessel got stranded in the pounding waves within sight of horrified spectators. The 9 crewmen who took refuge in the rear of the boat either froze to death or were washed overboard. The America relied on the sheer strength of her wheelsman.
My arms were so tired from gripping the wheel that they ached for a week afterwards. Thor Hagen, wheelsman.
The America was just a rough trip, and they were successful in getting in, getting out of the weather. They couldn't get to their own dock. They ended up going right straight into the harbor to where the freight sheds are over there now. Quite an experience for them on the America as a survivor, and then to basically watch what happened with the Mataafa as it was trying to get into the canal.
It was a great day, the boat day. Especially the one day of the week was Sunday was boat day, and that's the one they got dressed up for. They all took baths, and they got dressed up for the Sunday boat day, and that was kind of fun.
Boat day on Isle Royale was a wild mix, part social gathering, part marketplace. The America brought orders of fruit and vegetables, basic supplies, and served as a magnet for friends and neighbors.
It was the connection to civilization.
If they needed groceries, you would hand them a list on one trip, and they'd pick it up and bring it out for the next one. If we didn't have ice here, the ships normally brought ice out in 100-pound cakes, and which by the time they got here were 50 pounds, but oh, but you still bought 100 pounds.
The ship gave summer residents and fishing families a reason to gather and share the news of the day. A simple post office at Tobin Harbor played a critical role in the community.
Jimmy Lawrence is connected to the Connollys. Lichties and Dasslers were connected. So that's our harbor.
There was something about the America coming around that corner that made them feel not so isolated and alone. And that was really important for my grandmother. She wrote 32 letters to one person, 39 to somebody else, 9 to Mrs. Rugg, 11 to Bessie. Boat day was huge because people were coming and going. And then, of course, the mail. And then the supplies, and then everybody from Tobin Harbor, and it's a pretty big community, is down there. You go down there and meet everybody, and then I'd say to you, oh, come on over for cards on Friday, and you'd say, okay, if the weather's good. I'm sure you'd say something like that, you know, because that would be important. If it was bad, you know, you wouldn't come.
Wherever there was a dock deep enough for her, the America would pause to exchange mail and freight before continuing on. In Grand Marais and elsewhere, it was a big event to go down and meet the boat when it came in. In Tofte, it was the wildlife that greeted her.
Every time the America gave 3 blasts of his whistle to announce that it was coming close to the dock, the wolves in the hills would hear it and they'd start howling and the passengers would get excited on the ship. And you would too. Even today you'd get excited, I think. When you had the America, it brought with it not only supplies, it brought family, it brought businessmen, it brought tourists and elegant ladies looking along the shore. That was a real exciting thing.
There was never any lingering, there was never any kind of hanging out. So the exchange would be made, a lumberjack would get off, the mail going both ways, whatever freight was going, and then away it went.
It's kind of like you prospecting. You wouldn't know what would you'd find. There was always something to talk about when the boat landed.
In 1908, extremely dry weather sparked devastating forest fires across the upper Midwest. Tinder dry slash left over from decades of lumbering operations fueled ravenous fires along the shore. By early September, large fires threatened towns and burned homesteads.
Grand Marais is in great danger of being burned and no avenue of escape. Forest fires raging within a mile of town, and fate of the place is in doubt. Duluth Evening Herald, September 8th, 1908.
The fires were large enough to prompt the governor of Minnesota to order steamers like the America to stand by for emergency evacuation. Communities like Beaver Bay, Grand Marais, and Chicago Bay were literally on edge.
The wind changed yesterday, and there is a strong possibility that the town was swept out by the fire before the America reached the scene. No further news of the situation will be received until the return of the America. She is due to arrive in Duluth at midnight tonight. Duluth Evening Herald, September 12, 1908.
A young engineer named Ralph Russell Tinkham came through Duluth that fall to begin design work on a newly approved light station 3 miles up from the Split Rock River. On September 12th, he booked his passage on the America and took a stroll along the canal. In his journal, he writes,
"The fog whistle at the end of the pier was blowing on account of the heavy pall of smoke, so thick one could not see the main shore of Duluth from the pier. Ralph Russell Tinkham, engineer."
The next morning, Tinkham and 40 firefighters were among the passengers heading up the shore to Grand Marais.
There were no fires that I noticed amounting to anything until we arrived off Split Rock. Here they said they were fighting fire to within a half mile of the settlement. Conundrum Point and the next point above that, the one Split Rock light station is to be erected upon, were all burned over, as well as the mainland back from there and still burning. Around Grand Marais, the fire was close to the town and they were fighting day and night.
The America carried frightened settlers and townsfolk from points all along the shore, people forced to the water's edge by the advancing flames. When suddenly the wind shifted, the city was saved with no loss of life, and another chapter in the America's story became legend. The America and the Booth Company brought some perks to the remote communities they served. The steamer operated as an ambulance for many.
When you got sick, they shipped you to Duluth on the America, and everything. It was the lifeline. It was the connection.
On the lighter side, it offered the local baseball teams a chance to compete for the American dream.
The Tofte baseball team, they would tell the captain, Hector or Smith, "We have a ball game next week, can you bring us up to the game?" And there's no charge for that, of course. There were teams up and down in Hovland and up and down the shore, but where else in the United States did you take a steamship to play baseball?
Here is a picture. I'm so glad that the family took it. That is the steamer America.
By 1920, the crew of the America was a well-oiled machine. With a regular schedule and Captain Smith's fine leadership, the passengers kept coming. Eileen Schubert hired on as a female steward.
I know that my grandmother was assigned just to do general cleaning of the rooms and see to the passengers. She had to clean out the women's lavatory, and I guess she laughed. She said that when they flushed the toilets, it was so loud that it scared half of the passengers to death. But oh, here, this is some of the, there's the women. There they are. Wow. In their black stockings.
We go to the salon in the evenings and have a real high time.
Bill Wasbatten worked his way up from deckhand to wheelsman and did a stint on the America in the 1920s.
Well, there was one time the girls forgot to pull their shades, and I was standing on the dock waiting for the stevedores to bring out the stuff, and they forgot to pull the shades, and they looked out and saw me standing right in front of them practically. And of course I heard about it at breakfast.
The food there, from what I've heard, was excellent food, especially the whitefish. People always would say that the whitefish was so good.
There was the benefits of all the ships, incidentally. In them days, why, they really put down the food.
This is the captain, and Eileen is the third woman from the left, and Captain Smith is the third man.
Eileen's son, Duncan, signed on as a pantry boy at age 14 and crewed on the America with his mother.
This is Duncan standing at, by the gangway. He used to call the steamer America that stout little ship.
One of Eileen's daughters fondly recalls a ride on the America from those early days. The experience left an impression.
I was curled and ruffled from head to toe, and I was passed along from lap to lap all through the social salon. It was so beautiful. It was like an extra long living room. It was very, very charming. I would go to the cook and get bread, and Jessie and I would go to the bow of the ship. It had a very pointed bow, and we would feed the seagulls that would trail along. The ship was always something very special to me. It was so white. I used to think it was the most beautiful ship, and I was so happy that Mama and Duncan were there.
It was a nice, friendly group, and it was often referred to as the happy ship. The crew got along, and I think if you didn't fit in, I think you found there was a way found for you to fit no more. And someone else who did fit in had a chance to work on the America.
At Split Rock, lighthouse tenders delivered most of the supplies needed to build and maintain the station, but mail service was handled by collection steamers like the America. The daughter of keeper Franklin Coville describes how it worked.
If they, the America, had mail or passengers or whatever, they would blow their whistle. The fog signal would be started to answer. Then the America would anchor out in the lake and wait for the launch to come out. Elena Colville Myers.
The mid-1920s brought changes to the shore. Improvements to Highway 61 continued the effort to connect Duluth with towns on up to the Canadian border. Automobiles ushered in a new wave of tourism. Independent-minded travelers began to move on their own schedule. Fishing families along the route took the opportunity to supplement their income. They built more cottages and lodges along the road.
Every cabin, you could say condominium to this day, you can attribute to the commercial fishermen because they built the first cabins.
Especially after the road was connected from Duluth up to the border. They built little tourist cabins. The idea was we could promote tourism here with this fresh, healthy air.
Gadines that owned cabins here in Tofte, were building cabins at the time, they bought a car, and that car was delivered onto the Tofte dock in the mid-1920s. But the roads weren't open completely from Duluth to Thunder Bay. So you could only drive 20 miles either side of Tofte before you ran into the woods.
Fishermen along the shore began to move their catch to market by truck. For ships like the America, both freight tonnage and passenger numbers dropped. But she still held value on Isle Royale and was a link between cities along the lakeshore.
Yes, the Highway 61 had been extended. There were starting to be automobiles and trucking and whatnot, but the America was still pretty viable, important to a lot of places along the shore, and especially as the big communication, dependable communication thing between Duluth Superior Harbor and Fort William and Port Arthur.
The 1928 season started like so many others for the America. She was ready and one of the first ships to begin service up the shore. The crew roster included a new first mate, John Wick. He was a Norwegian immigrant with plenty of experience on the ocean and on the Great Lakes.
John Wick sailed on what was called the Poker Fleet, and he sailed on the Jack for 8 years until he took the job on the America.
So he had, a license, a captain's license for unlimited tonnage, unlimited waters, could sail anywhere around the United States. Where Captain Smith was pretty much a coastal license. He couldn't really go more than probably about 25 miles offshore with his license. So there was a difference.
Apparently was getting a bit frustrated because he wasn't being promoted to be captain. And I think he knew that the captain of the America was going to be retiring soon. And so he figured if he switched over to the America, which was a much smaller boat, that he might be able to get the captain's job on the America.
As they're, talking in the pilot house and getting to know one another better, the Wick kind of kept, I think, bringing up that he had better papers.
The America sailed from Duluth that Wednesday morning, June 6th, heading up the shore. But her guests had requested a slight deviation from her regular route.
Instead of going right up the shore into Canada, they made a trip out to Isle Royale in the dark.
They had some special passengers on board, kind of business people who belonged to the Washington Club. They decided because these people were on board, they wanted to get fishing as early as they could, they would run them into Washington Harbor on the way up to Fort William.
The plan shaved 15 hours off the fisherman's journey, but landed the America's new first mate in unfamiliar territory in the middle of the night.
I don't believe that he'd even been up there during the day prior to that, because the ship that he had been sailing on the previous 8 years wasn't the kind of boat that would go into that area.
A Duluth banker, George Barnum, and 3 members of the Johns family were among the passengers returning to Washington Harbor.
They got off at 2 o'clock in the morning from the America. Perfectly clear night, beautiful night, he said. And then they came over here, my dad and his mom and dad, our grandfather and grandmother, and Mr. Barnum went down to his place to go to sleep.
Sam Sivertson and his wife Theodora stayed on the boat so they didn't have to risk getting off in the dark.
He had broken his leg at the island, and so they had to go to Duluth for the doctor to get his leg set. Grandpa was supposed to get off there, but he couldn't get down the gangplank. So he was going to ride around the island, and when he got back the next day, they were going to be at a different dock and he could get off the boat. So that's the reason he was on there, for the trip around the island.
Captain Smith retired for the evening, leaving First Mate Wick and wheelsman Fred Nelson at the helm.
By the time they got to Isle Royale, the version that I've enjoyed the most, I guess, has been that Captain Smith had kind of heard enough. That Captain Smith said, basically, if you're so good, take the boat. And all he told him was to stay off the rocks, keep it away from the shore. Well, that night with a full moon and the trees growing right up tight to the shoreline, what he did was stay off the south shore, figuring that the shoreline was really where the edge of the dark shadow was. And there's really hardly anything blacker than a moon shadow.
On the way out of Washington Harbor, they clipped an underwater rock and put a hole in the hull.
So she started taking water, and they were still, of course, going down Washington Harbor, ready to turn into the North Gap, and that's when Captain Smith said to beach her. And as they turned into that little cove where the shallows were, they ran over another reef and it literally stuck.
Eileen Schubert and her son Duncan were on board that night and asleep in their respective crew quarters.
She was worried about her son, Duncan. Everybody out of her way. She went down to the men's quarters in the front. The lights went out. She was all alone down there. And she's feeling around. And she found his bunk, and then she reached down and she felt that hair. And she pulled it and then realized it was a jacket, and I'm sure she said to herself, what am I doing down here? And meanwhile, the whistles are going, the evacuation, and she had to go through that freezing cold water and make it all the way out of there again. And finally, a bedraggled, wet mother came on the freezing cold boat deck, and I imagine he probably said, Mother, what did you do? But they got on the lifeboat and made it to shore.
In all, some 30 crew members and 10 passengers were evacuated, many of them delivered to Singer's Island View Resort on Washington Island. The only fatality was a dog tied up at the stern, whose owners were unable to rescue him. The captain returned to Duluth to report the details. All accounts gave he and his crew high marks for a calm and swift evacuation. Meanwhile, locals salvaged what they could.
Sam Sivertson had his belongings on the boat on the America, and my grandfather went over and they had long pike poles in those days with hooks on the end, and he was able to fish that trunk of Sam Sivertson's off the America, and he got all his belongings.
They had a cargo of fruits and vegetables on board the America, and they all floated to the surface, and they drifted around Washington Harbor for weeks. And whenever the fisherman wanted a piece of fruit or anything, he just dipped his gaff down in the water, and he'd take bananas and strawberries and cantaloupes and whatever. So that was kind of the bright side of a sunken ship.
In the aftermath, an investigation cleared Captain Smith of any wrongdoing. Mate Wick received a reprimand.
For reckless navigation or something like that, because he was in charge at the time that the grounding happened. And so when you're in charge, you're responsible.
Rumors surfaced almost immediately.
There was strong suspicion that it was an insurance sinking.
Because the opening of Highway 61 along Minnesota's North Shore had cut drastically into Booth's passenger and freight business.
But was it literally sunk for the insurance? I really, really doubt it.
I guess I'd like to think that, that my cousin would have more integrity than to do that.
I don't really think there was insurance money for a big settlement. Booth did not make money on the loss of the America. The America was never truly replaced. It was a page that was torn out of the book. It was gone.
The first winter she was stranded, ice and wave action cut away at the America's forward cabins and pilot house. Gravity pulled her hull deeper into Lake Superior's icy grip. A hard-hat diver named Cornelius Flynn bought the salvage rights to the America in 1929, confident that the wreck could be raised. His plans crashed with the stock market. Scuba divers started the next chapter for the America. In the 1950s and 60s, Jacques Cousteau and a wave of new technology made sport diving popular. Lake Superior shipwrecks were a new frontier filled with treasures.
We found a perfume bottle, a cigarette box, we found a watch, an actual pocket watch.
In Duluth, an entrepreneur named Jim Marshall was enthralled with diving. He expanded his outfitter business to include a dive shop, and when he met a commercial diver named Paul Flynn, they started talking about the America. Paul Flynn inherited the salvage rights from his dad and knew the wreck firsthand.
So he knew the condition of the ship at the point it sank, before the superstructure was taken off and before it shifted downwards in the ice.
In 1965, Marshall purchased the salvage rights with an eye toward cashing in.
The hull was constructed of Swedish steel, and the number I recall is $250,000 worth of Swedish steel, which in the early 60s was a tremendous amount of money. So I think that was the original motivation for thinking about it. But then as he got more intrigued with the story of the America, he learned more about it, he talked to more people who sailed on it. I think he became hooked on the history of it and the value it was to the entire region.
The hope was that the cabins could be restored and turn it into a sort of a floating hotel and be able to eat in the dining room and whatnot on the boat to make it kind of a dockside sailing experience.
Marshall gathered a team, made a plan, and secured the appropriate approvals and permits to raise her. By September, his crew was on site at Isle Royale with commercial diver Chuck McLernan as the project lead.
The theory was that they would patch any openings on the boat that would allow them to pump the water out and pump air in, and it would rise like a bobber. It was a gutsy move, but that was my dad.
By mid-October, patches were in place, and they were on track for floating the wreck by October 20th.
Their process seemed to make sense, and what amazes me is they were going to try and accomplish it within about 4 weeks. They literally planned to go up at the end of September and by November be towing the ship back to Duluth. That's ambitious. I think the patching and the assessment of the boat went faster than they planned, but then the weather started to set in, so it became harder for them to even begin to work on it. And they ended up in dangerous situations for the crew. It started to freeze.
The onset of winter drove the team off the water and convinced them to hang it up for the season. The pause gave divers from beyond the shore the chance to weigh in on Marshall's salvage plan.
He actually got threatening letters and calls about it, and people saying that he was doing the wrong thing by actually trying to take the wreck off the lake. History should leave it preserved where it was. The diving community in the Twin Cities so loved having the destination of the America to dive. That community did not want to lose their toy.
When spring came, the salvage crew returned to Isle Royale. Their first dive was a shock.
The patches had literally been blown off the boat. There was a hole torn in the boat on the side, and apparently someone had placed TNT or some kind of an explosive, detonated it, and it absolutely ruined all the work that had been done that far. Further, it weakened the structure of the boat from what they could tell. They were no longer sure that it had, the integrity that it would take to actually float the boat again.
The question of whether the boat was dynamited to prevent it from being salvaged is, to me, is still a question. The FBI came in and actually did some investigation, and they were never able to prove anything.
The National Park Service reversed course and withdrew its approval.
A Park Service lawyer, Solicitor Redmond, issued an opinion that the boat belonged to the Park Service, that it had been so much time between when Captain Flynn had acquired the rights to the boat to when the salvage was attempted, that it effectively had been abandoned and it was within the park boundaries, and so it belonged to the National Park Service.
And at that point, one of his partners was Pat O'Brien, who was his attorney. And Pat just said, we just don't have the horsepower to go up against the federal government. There's no point in arguing this with them. None of us have enough money or time to actually argue it. And then, so he gave up on it, but he always went back and visited.
You wonder if it's not better preserved where it is now, enjoyed by maybe not as many people. It's still the most popular diving attraction at Isle Royale. Even if it continues to slowly dissolve away, it will still be a diving attraction.
All right, here we go. All right, ready?
The spirit of the America lives on in the crew of the Voyager 2. Captain Benny Oberg pilots the boat around Isle Royale in the path blazed by the steamer. He marvels at the skill of the captains who've come before him.
Running around this island with none of this fancy equipment and just a compass and a stopwatch, that's unreal to me.
They didn't feel courageous, it's just what they did. That's just what I learned. My dad taught me this, and this is what I'm going to do.
From the deck of the Voyager, stories of the America come easy.
It was just fun on boat day to see it come in, and you got your mail, and you got the groceries, and whatever have you. And so it was a great boat.
When it came up over the horizon on the lake, people would get excited because they knew, we were going to get whatever supplies we were looking for, or grandma's coming, or whatever it was.
America is really remembered as the golden days of fishing and resorts on Isle Royale.
When did cars get invented? When did the North Shore Road go in? It was the transportation up and down there.
It was the common thread through all the families that settled. They depended on it for their very existence.
The America stocked growing communities and planted the seeds of tourism on Isle Royale and the North Shore. It fostered a culture that runs generations deep. It remains a North Shore legend.